Welcome. Today is 25th of October, 2015. We're here in a chilly but yet sunny day here in North Idaho, and we are joined on the line from Michigan, very close to Canada, the land of Trudeau at the moment. We're joined by Boniface of Unam Sanctum Catholicum, the website, a.k.a. Philip Campbell. Thank you for joining us today.
It should be Philip Campbell, a.k.a. Boniface, technically, but I think they get the point.
That's right. And so my listeners might remember you from episode 14, where we talked about being a mayor in a small town. And as all traditional Catholics should know, is that in the traditional Catholic calendar today, this is the Feast of Christ the King, which was actually a more recent feast on the calendar, although not at all out of tune with the spirit of the Catholic liturgy, which celebrates the social kingship of Christ, and the great encyclical Pope Pius XI on that subject, which, by the way, is always murder to read in the breviary, though. I wish they wouldn't have done that. But beside that, so today we're here to talk about a time in which the social kingship was in full splendor in medieval Europe, and possibly really the beginning of that kingship on its way out. And so here we will be talking about Boniface VIII, which, of course, your nom de guerre in your blog.
Yeah, when I started Unam Sanctum Catholicum back in 2007, it was at the beginning of my disillusionment with kind of American conservative politics, because up until that time, I'd pretty much amalgamated myself to the Protestant conservative tradition in this country regarding my political views, and I'd started to come out of that, and kind of in protest against that, I named my handle on the blog Boniface after this great pope of the late Middle Ages, who more than any other asserted the prerogatives and primacy of the government of Christ over the secular rulers. So I just think it's very fitting that we're doing this on this day of Christ the King.
Absolutely. So let's get into it. What's the time period for Boniface VIII, just in case anyone's somewhat fuzzy on what period of history we're in?
Boniface was pope at the turn from the 13th going into the 14th century. I want to say, I know it's 1302 is the end of his pontificate. I want to say 1293 or 1292 is the beginning. But we're talking right about the turn of the 13th going into the 14th century.
Okay, excellent. So now let's look at the, just before Boniface VIII is the famed Celestine V. And so let's talk a little bit about what was Boniface's, at that time, Cardinal Gaetani's role in the election and resignation of Pope Celestine.
Right. Well, Celestine V probably has gotten more press in the past 600 years than ever before since the resignation of Benedict XVI, because, of course, Saint Celestine V was the last pontiff to resign prior to Benedict. Now, at the time of Celestine V, most parties agree, no matter what you think about papal resignations, most parties agree that Celestine V was, at least in a worldly sense, not fit to, didn't have the wherewithal to be a pope in the late 13th century. Let's just put it that way. That he had a kind of natural gentleness and piety and shunning of worldly affairs that the papacy of that time was necessarily enmeshed in. Now, one of the cardinals of the court at that time was Cardinal Gaetani, which will be the future Boniface VIII. Cardinal Gaetani is an interesting character. He's related, and it's really a nightmare trying to figure out the relations of the Italian families at this time in history, but he's strongly allied to the Orsini family, which is a very powerful central Italian family at the time. He holds 17 benefices, which are revenue-producing properties, not exactly akin to dioceses, but 17 different ecclesiastical properties that he's the bishop of. When Celestine V began thinking about resigning, he was pressured by many cardinals. Cardinal Gaetani has gone down kind of as the one who was, I guess, behind pressuring Celestine V to resign, although from what I know, this is not entirely fair. There was many other cardinals who were all pressuring Pope Celestine to resign. Cardinal Gaetani was one of the most influential. And he actually was instrumental in when Celestine's scruples about resignation was whether or not it was licit for a pontiff to resign. And Gaetani actually did a study of history and canon law up to that point and helped to convince Pope Celestine that it was permitted for a pope to resign of his own free will. And so he helped facilitate Celestine's resignation, both in laying the groundwork in studying the precedents for it, and after Celestine resigned and Boniface was subsequently elected pope, one of his first acts was to ratify or validate the resignation of Celestine V to make sure that there was continuity and no chance of a schism. And he also, after Celestine resigned, he allowed, and I have in my notes allowed, or in parentheses, imprisoned, ? He allowed Celestine to remain behind in a castle in Ferentino for his retirement. And there's question about whether this was a forced retirement or not. But of course, all it would have taken was Celestine to say, I didn't really resign freely, and there could have been a major schism. So Boniface, let's just say that he strongly advocated that Celestine remain nearby so that he couldn't go off and later change his mind about the resignation. Of course, he didn't. He was a saintly pontiff and went off into obscurity. But so Gaetani, he's from a powerful worldly family. Like I said, he has multiple benefices, and he really wants to be a power broker in the political situation of the day. Is he worldly? I would say he is worldly, but not any more worldly than others. I think Dante treats him too hard when he puts him in hell. Dante's city, Florence, being a great opponent of the Pope, but he was worldly, but not any worse than any other churchman of the day.
What can we say about Boniface's views on papal authority in civil as well as ecclesiastical spheres?
Well, he issued 3 bulls on this very subject. One, the famous Clericos Laicos, which we'll talk about later, and Unam Sanctam. And there was a third one that starts with an A. Its name escapes me at the moment. Do you know that third one I'm trying to remember? What is it? It escapes me
right now.
But at any rate, Boniface's views on papal authority, he had the 13th century had a long tradition of strong popes going back to the time of Innocent III, who is often seen as the culmination of papal temporal power in the Middle Ages. And so Boniface was kind of at the crest of this high point of papal temporal power. And what we know from his writings is that he seemed to believe that there was always going to be an intrinsic hostility between the lay and the ecclesiastical authorities. He mentions in Clericos Laicos that the princes, the secular authorities, have always ever tried to usurp the role of the church. And so, although he sees it's possible for the two to work together, he sees that there's always a kind of latent hostility with the lay always trying to usurp the power of the church. The lay authorities, the temporal powers, he stated should have 0 jurisdiction over the clergy without papal permission. Now, in the time that Boniface is writing, this is really, I'm going to say this is some canonical wishful thinking to suggest that the lay authority never had any jurisdiction over the church. Maybe in the canonical sense they didn't, but you and I know that in practice all over medieval Europe, because things are very decentralized and it's hard for communication and whatnot, that temporal princes frequently exercised a phenomenal amount of control over their local churches. But he was kind of riding the wave of the investiture controversy, the strong papacy of Innocent III and his successors, and pushing back against this traditional exercise of temporal jurisdiction. In Unam Sanctam, he specifically reaffirms the perennial teaching of the Church of the two-sword theory, which Innocent III had stated, but also it goes way back to Pope Gelasius in the 5th century. The two-sword theory was, of course, taken from the Gospel of Luke, where before our Lord is going to crucifixion, he asked the disciples if they have any weapons, and Peter says, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords," and Jesus says, "It is enough." And so the fact that Peter had 2 swords in the Gospel was interpreted allegorically as the sword of the temporal power and the sword of the ecclesiastical power. So the two-sword theory holds that both the temporal and the ecclesiastical power are ultimately under the oversight of Peter, but Peter can only wield one sword directly, the ecclesiastical power. The other sword, let's say he farms out or he gives to the lay authorities, who by virtue of their lay state are more appropriately, it's fitting for them to wield the political sword. But the thing is, they're not totally independent. They're not off on their own. There's no total separation of church and state. They wield it at the will and sufferance of the priestly power, is what he will say. So both the swords are in a way under the competency of the church, but the church can actually only wield the ecclesiastical sword. So everything ultimately is subject to the church and the Roman pontiff, who is the head of the church. And this really is just a more precise restatement of the doctrine of Innocent III, and it's implied in the teaching of Pope Gelasius as well, who first formulated the theory. So I guess we could say that he's a very, very strong advocate of papal authority, even so far as to say that it can make judgments on the temporal exercise of the authority of secular kingdoms.
Certainly. Ascolta fili, by the way. Listen, O son. That's the third bull.
Ascolta fili. Thank you.
Yeah, fili.
Fili.
Listen, O son. So,
right.
So in this, he is very much in the mold of the earlier pontiffs you mentioned, Innocent III, and is approaching that, again, muddied waters of church-state relations, which were such a troublesome issue throughout the whole of the Middle Ages. Now, Innocent III had great success against the temporal powers, and in fact subdued them all. Urban II, even while going to France to preach a crusade and looking for support, he also excommunicates the King of France for putting away his lawful wife and living with a concubine. So, so popes had entered the arena before with kings and sparred with them. So Boniface, has a long tradition of confident, confrontations of popes in the past behind him. So then he enters into his first conflict, which is Sicily, which has been, somewhat problematic for some time, and it's been at war with the Sicilian Vespers, with the great debates between the Angevins, that is the French, and Charles II. Describe this conflict a little bit of the Sicilian Vespers and how Boniface ended up resolving it in a way rather different from what he sought out to do.
Yeah, well, this was a real nightmare as far as who had authority over Sicily. It was fought over by the Angevins. Charles II had claimed it. Also, the Aragonese wanted it. The Sicilian Vespers was this great revolt against the Angevin rule in Sicily, where at Vespers on a certain day, there was a prearranged conspiracy that the Sicilians were going to rise up and massacre the Angevins, and it was quite a nasty slaughter. But after this massacre, the Pope got involved to mediate an end to the conflict to get to Now, Boniface wanted the Angevins back in control of Sicily. The Sicilians hated the Angevins, and so Boniface had to mediate between the Sicilians and the Angevins, and he mediated this by negotiating a marriage between Blanche of Naples to James II of Aragon, I believe, in compensation, because the Aragonese also had a claim on Sicily, and so this marriage was supposed to be the compensation for Sicily going to Charles of Anjou, Charles II. Now, the Sicilians, they had just gone through this revolt to get rid of the Angevins. They hated the French, and they did not want the Pope's offer, and so they went and offered the throne to Frederick of Aragon, who was the brother of James II. Now, this was totally not the way Boniface wanted things to go. He was trying to get the Angevins back in control firmly, but he saw that the Sicilians were so decidedly opposed to French rule that he reluctantly ratified the claim of Frederick, but this was supposed to pass to the Angevins when he died. So he was thinking that he would die quickly, within maybe a few years. And in fact, he went to live on for 35 years. So, and then, of course, after 35 years expired, Boniface is long gone. They're supposed to turn the island back over to the Angevins, and they don't. At that point, they say that they find an excuse to get out of the agreement. And so his first attempts at political meddling in Sicily really fail, and it winds up under the control of a party that he did not want on his back door, because the Angevins, whatever might be said about them, he felt that they were more amenable to his aspirations than the Aragonese or the other parties. The Holy Roman Emperors, had always had their eye on Sicily as well. So so his mediation actually, he ended up mediating it to a power that he didn't want to have lordship over the island.
And that's also not the only place where Boniface VIII's mediation it doesn't actually have the effect that he hopes, or in other places gets completely spun back at him. So what's the result of Boniface's political activity in Italy? Genoa and Venice have been at war. He's hoping to get a crusade going to the Holy Land. And other city-states are involved, such as Florence. So what do the Venetians and the Genoese think about that? How does this one play out?
Well, to put it simply, they just positively reject his intervention. They want nothing to do with it, and he basically can get nowhere. These different cities, depending on who the Pope supports, there's this division in Italy between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines at the time. And it's kind of complex, their origin, but if you want the dumbed down medieval Italy for dummies version, the Guelphs are a party that tends to be supportive of papal temporal claims in Italy. The Ghibellines tend to support the jurisdiction of the Holy Roman Empire in Italy, and so Venice and Genoa don't want anything to do with his intervention. He tries to mess around in Florence as well. Florence is a hotbed of anti-papal Ghibelline activity, and you have even multiple parties, even within the major divisions, the blacks and the whites and whatnot. And so he tries to mediate something with Florence. This doesn't work, and in the end, he invites Charles of Valois in to purify the city. He invites a French conqueror in. Charles Valois, by the way, is brother of Philip the Fair, the King of France. So he invites this French lord in to purify the city, which means plunder it and destroy it and exile the Ghibelline party, which included Dante. This was the time that Dante was exiled. So this puts into perspective Dante's hatred of this pope and why he's upside down in hell with his feet on fire, right? Because it was at the invitation of Boniface VIII that the Valois came into Florence and exiled the Ghibellines. So, but that of course is temporary. Eventually they come back. They're restored, and so his attempts to build more of a stronger pro-Guelph coalition in northern Italy fail. He's unable to establish himself as a legitimate power broker between these different city-states, and so the conflict between Guelph and Ghibelline, Pope and Emperor, it largely remains unresolved, and he's unable to assert his temporal claims further north in Italy.
So apart from the struggle with Guelphs and Ghibellines, there's also another powerful faction that Boniface manages to alienate and not be successful with, namely the Colonna. Let's talk about the Colonna and the impact of that on the local Italian politics.
Yeah, well, the Colonna are a problem closer to home, right in the city of Rome, and one has to understand that Rome in the Middle Ages, you have the Pope, who is the sovereign in a literal sense, the sovereign of the papal territories, and has been since the time of Charlemagne. But under the Pope, there's these powerful nobles, and they kind of blend their temporal power into the ecclesiastical sphere. So you have families who, they have lots of lands, but they also might have a nephew or a brother who is a cardinal, and the cardinal will, of that family will tend to represent that family's interests in the Roman Curia. And one of those powerful families were the Colonna, and they tended to be against the policies of Boniface VIII. Now, just saying families, we shouldn't understand family as just a family. We should understand family like the way the mafia is a family, right? It's a complex political, ecclesiastical alliance, and some branches of the family, of any one of these families, are, they can be a little underhanded in the way they handle things. So let's just say that it's kind of like a mafioso situation with the Colonna, and they're not the only one. There's other I mentioned the Orsini earlier, and so Boniface makes what I would say the ill-advised decision to intervene in a personal family affair with the Colonna. I don't think we really need to go into the details of it, but the thing is, when you intervene in a family affair, you're necessarily going to make enemies one way or another. And so he intervenes in this family affair with the Colonna, and he ends up making serious enemies with them, such that they try to strike at him. They try to attack him physically and weaken his power. He ends up deposing the Colonna cardinals, and after he deposes these cardinals, they declare his election invalid. So they start pushing the claim that Boniface is in fact an anti-pope, that his election was invalid, and this is interesting because it's a foreshadowing of conciliarism in the 15th century. They appeal to a future council against Boniface VIII. And there's actually a war. There's actually a physical war. Boniface has to marshal the forces of the Papal States and his various allies. The Pope besieges them at a city. He's able to reduce them to subservience, but he takes their lands and their possessions away and bestows them upon the Orsini and his relatives. The Orsini are kind of the mafioso group that is more allied to Boniface VIII. He gives the property to his relatives. And the Colonna cardinals, many of them will go to exile to France, and this is important to keep in mind later because they go to exile into France, but they're going to bide their time there, and we're going to see that they will come back again to bite Boniface. So this was a short-term victory for him, but he did manage to alienate one of the most powerful Roman families, and they will go off to play worm-tongue in the court of Philip of France, and that's going to be disastrous for Boniface later.
Never go against the family.
Right.
My very poor Marlon Brando impersonation. But anyway, so you mentioned, of course, you get to Philip the Fair. Boniface turns his attention to conflicts as far away as Denmark, England, France, and Scotland, intervening, for instance, in the beginnings of the 100 Years' War with Edward I and Philip the Fair, and again in the Anglo-Scots Wars. How did he employ the Church's weapons in his interventions, namely the suspension, interdict, excommunication, etc.?
Yeah, well, there were three main tools that he could bring to bear. The first you mentioned is papal interdict. Now, interdict is you talk about censures not being used anymore, like excommunication or various theological censures. Interdict, forget about it. This is something you would never see a modern pope wield, which is simply kind of a suspension of the administration of all sacraments in a given ecclesiastical jurisdiction. So the church isn't allowed to solemnize weddings, to celebrate baptisms except in the case of emergency. Divine services are suspended. Now, so he could apply an interdict over a certain territory if that temporal lord didn't assent to whatever the Pope wanted. In the past, this had been a very powerful weapon. Innocent III had applied it against King John of England. I believe it was utilized by Pope St. Gregory VII in his struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. And the idea was that because the religious faith of the people was so strong, that when they saw their divine services suspended, that they would riot, or that they would put huge pressure on their sovereign to make peace with the Pope. This, of course, is what happened when Gregory VII excommunicated Henry IV. He immediately faced revolts from his whole kingdom. So he applied papal interdict fairly frequently. One interesting thing, Ryan, is I've never seen any studies on this as to what degree interdict was actually observed. When he applies an interdict in a faraway kingdom like England, and they get this interdict. Now, a lot of times the sovereign wouldn't even allow the bull to be published in the kingdom. But when the priests get this dictate, do they obey it? Or does the king say, yeah, you keep on saying mass, and they just keep on doing it? I don't know. I've never seen any study on that. But that's what interdict was in theory at least, a suspension of any sacraments and services in the region. Of course, you have excommunication. This had gone, as you mentioned, he was on solid ground in pushing excommunication against sovereigns who threatened the church. You mentioned Innocent III, Gregory VII, but we of course could take this all the way back to Emperor Theodosius, and Bishop Ambrose. So, but the thing is that after the church's success in the investiture controversy with the excommunication of Henry IV of Germany, when the whole kingdom revolted against him, that was so successful that its success kind of became the seed of its own failure, in that popes increasingly resorted to excommunication of sovereigns until the weapon was wielded so much that it started to get blunt. Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, the Stupor Mundi, right, the great medieval enemy of the church, I believe, I can't remember, I think he was excommunicated 7 or 8 times.
Something in that ballpark.
Yeah, and at that point, it starts to lose its efficacy when you're wielding it that much. And Boniface was constantly threatening and using it, and so it was increasingly ignored. Now, the Pope could also put pressure on a sovereign by the use of the papal legates, who were extremely influential individuals. The papal legate, of course, is the eyes and ears of the Pope in any given kingdom, and especially with regards to the church's temporal interests. So a papal legate is like the political representative of the papacy, and you want to have, it's always in the interest of the kings to have a papal legate they can control. And I'm thinking of Cardinal Wolsey in Henry VIII's England, who was totally, in the service of the king. But of course, the popes wanted legates who were totally in the service of the papacy, and in Boniface's time, this tended to be the case more than not. And so the papal legate could put pressure on the kings, and this was the organ of control that the church had locally. So Boniface made ample exercise of his authority through all these means, but he often was not successful. In many cases, the papal legate resented Boniface's pretensions. If you think you're a papal legate in France, or somewhere like Denmark, who is Boniface VIII? He's the successor of Peter, but he's a name that you recite in the Mass, and maybe you're probably never going to see him. You don't know what he's doing. If your sovereign lets a bull be published, you might read something he wrote. But compare that to the king. Who's the king? The king is some guy you see all the time. You're very familiar with him. You probably knew his father. You probably are in charge of, you or some other important churchman is in charge of forming his sons. You feel, if you're a papal legate, many times closer to the king than the pope. Now, the popes will try to combat this by appointing their own guys, their own people from Italy to go up there at times. But when church and state come into conflict, this further facilitates the feeling that the church is something foreign. That what are these Italians doing meddling around up here? And this has to do with the rise of the nation state, which we'll get to next. But at any rate, like everything else Boniface does, he's very gung-ho in applying these measures, but with mixed success, or sometimes they backfire on him.
And yet Innocent III had great success against, of course, John I of England, as we mentioned, and of course, we'll probably do a whole podcast on that too, against the King of France, against the Holy Roman Emperor. All these different levels, he's absolutely successful fighting the Hohenstaufen, and the church is just, seemingly victorious in the church-state conflict. But when Boniface makes use of, the same papal authority to try to restore order, now he gets a lot of pushback. Now, all of a sudden, nothing is working out for him, and he's getting tons of resistance. What's changing in Christendom where it's just not working anymore?
Yeah, and we should mention that not only did Innocent III get John to back down, but he actually got John III to pledge England as a fief of the Pope, right? To acknowledge the Pope as the head of the feudal pyramid in England. I mean, that'd be a huge victory for the Pope. But you're right, in a short time, in less than 100 years, the situation changed. And part of it we can blame on Boniface VIII personally, that he seems to have been much more abrasive, that he seems to have been full of zeal without perhaps the requisite amount of prudence that such a office would demand. But really, I think there's two things outside Boniface's control that changed. Number one is the rise of the nation state, which I'm going to place in the mid-13th century, where we're transforming from a pre-modern political organization into what's going to be the prototype of what will later become the modern nation state. That is, if you were to go back into the 1100s and ask, go into France and ask a person there who he was, right? Just who are you? What his political identity was, he would probably say, I am a vassal of the Count of Artois, or I owe homage to the Duke of Anjou, right? That's how they would think of it. It was a series of personal relations solidified by oaths of vassalage. Now fast forward to the 1400s maybe, and ask that same person who you are, and he's going to say, I'm a Frenchman, right? I'm a subject of the King of France, or I'm an Englishman. And what's rising in this century is the identity of people based on their affiliation with a nation state, with a certain language group, the roots of nationalism, which is going to be so detrimental to Christendom. And so the nation state, the apparatus of the nation state, you could do a whole other podcast on this, but it was being built up through several power. In France, it was being built up by Philip Augustus, by St. Louis IX, and by Philip the Fair. In England, Edward I, and even Henry III, a long-reigning monarch who was unremarkable in many ways except in growing the administration of the nation-state. And so there's a slow kind of building of a national identity and the rise of nationalism. And even though this means in some sense that the state is going to be more efficiently administered, in other sense it means that the sense of a European kind of pan-Christian unity gets weakened, right? Because instead of a series of personal bonds that holds Christendom together, it becomes more of a us versus them, of us French versus those Germans, the us Austrians versus those filthy Italians, the English speakers versus the French, and you get the national divisions that we know and love today, right? So I think that the state became more powerful administratively, and that there was a more greater sense of nationalism, so that when the Pope tries to intervene and use the same mechanisms against the nation, against these kings that predecessors had, for one thing, the kings are more powerful in their own dominion. It's a lot less likely in the year 1300 that all of France is going to rise in revolt because the Pope excommunicates the king. The king is simply going to have more resources and administrative power to keep a lid on things in France than he did before. And number two, the French themselves are going to have a greater sense of Frenchness, of French nationalism to their king than they did 100 or 200 years ago. So that when the Pope intervenes, instead of seeing the Vicar of Christ intervening for the good of the church and souls, they're going to more likely view it in terms of an Italian meddling in French affairs. And so the French or whoever were less likely to see papal interventions in a positive light. And in France, we could suggest that this is a kind of proto-Gallicanism. So number one is the rise of the nation state. Number two, why Boniface wasn't successful is, and I've made this point before, the overuse of ecclesiastical penalties for what were perceived, rightly or wrongly, but what was perceived as merely secular ends. Now, for example, we're going to talk in a minute about
kings trying to raise money from the church for their wars. Previous kings had done this. Pope Innocent III had allowed kings to tax the church for the purpose of raising funds for a crusade. That had happened before. But what was happening now was that the church's apparatus and its penalties were perceived as being used for merely secular ends, for taking sides in a secular conflict between France and England, or Genoa and Venice, or to further the Pope's temporal claims in Italy. So it's not that people resented the Pope exercising authority, but it was increasingly resented when he seemed to apply these for merely temporal or secular ends. And so, for that reason, they were more ignored than they were in the past. And because the nation-state was stronger, the kings could back up their flaunting of papal power. Whew, that was long-winded.
But it definitely addresses the issue. And of course, we can see that when we get to, say, Henry VIII. And Pope Paul III excommunicates Henry VIII. Nothing happens.
Right.
Which is, there's other conditions that lead to that too. But the average person just thinks, well, the bishops have all accepted the royal supremacy. Well, what do we know about it? They've all done it. What do we say about it? Right? Except for Fisher, of course, who they beheaded. But,
Yep.
So there is no rising. So by the time you've got to there, oh yeah, it's just a conflict between Pope and King. We're used to that, old story. They'll resolve it. What does it have to do with us? I got to go out and get firewood. So, whereas compared to the 1100s, where Gregory VII shuts down Henry IV completely with this. So there's definitely this change. I think those really help to explain the ever growing and changing nature of the European consciousness, we might put it.
Although not to go down this rabbit hole, but as an aside, we do have to give a justification to the people of Cornwall who, at the time of the supremacy, revolted when their traditional Latin prayer books were replaced with vernacular ones, and they were like, "What the hell is this?" They actually rioted, and the guy representing the monarchy that came to put the vernacular prayer book in, they stuck a pitchfork through him and revolted for a few months until they were massacred. But so they didn't all
that was several years after. But yeah, that's right.
Right.
But but therein too, it's the effect. It's a tangible change they can actually see in their lives, just like the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now there's a tangible change they can actually see and perceive, because Henry now moves to suppressing all the monasteries. Now this is affecting everything they're doing, and now they're saying, "What happened? All right, we want the restoration of the faith, as it was." And now all of a sudden you see that like the Pilgrimage of Grace or the Pyrrhic Rebellion. We want the Mass in Latin as we've always had it. Now this change, but before, when the Pope merely said, "Okay, I hereby excommunicate your sovereign," nothing happened. This particular aspect, it didn't affect them the way it did in the 11th century.
And we should, to tie it back to Boniface, we should mention that Henry is only able to do what he did because he's reaping the benefits of a long period of development of the power of the nation state that begins in the time of Boniface VIII. So I think you were right at the very outset of this podcast when you said that this was really the turning point, the beginning of the dissolution of Christendom when it starts to fall apart. It is in Boniface VIII. It's not in 1517. It's way back here, at least politically, in the early 1300s.
Certainly, and of course, we've mentioned a little bit about the French and about Philip the Fair. How does the conflict, which becomes the final conflict for Boniface, with Philip the Fair fulminate, and how does the famous Bull Unam Sanctum come into it?
So, at this time, the King of England is Edward I of Braveheart fame, and the King of France is Philip the Fair, who is the grandson of St. Louis IX, I believe. Now, France and England are at war with one another, and because war is getting increasingly expensive, both parties, England and France, are seeking to find revenues for that war, and they obviously turn to the church. Now, King Edward is very voracious in his oppression of the church to get money from them. He demands from his bishops various amounts of revenue. He demands 1/2 of all church revenue, then 1/4. He makes these wild, vacillating demands. The clergy don't know what to do. They've never been oppressed by a monarch like that, in England at least, and so they appeal to Rome, and this just sets Edward off, like you wouldn't believe. That he basically treats it, and this is another thing we're going to see as a sign of the modern age. He treats an appeal to Rome as treason, as if you're appealing to a foreign sovereign over and above your king. And he declares that this gives him justification to start confiscating, just straight up confiscation of church property, Henry VIII style.
Praemunere, this actually becomes the law that Henry VIII will use to subdue the English clergy. Praemunere.
Right.
That you've appealed to Rome, and so they use this that accepting Cardinal Wolsey's legatine authority, which Henry, of course, pushed on them, that was itself an act of praemunere, and it all originates right here with Edward I.
Right, and of course, Edward I had no legal precedent for this. He was just a bully, so he begins confiscating the clergy. The clergy don't know what to do. They eventually reach a settlement where they agree to part with 1/3 of their holdings. He doesn't get all of that, of course, because they're pretty skilled at hiding their stuff too. When he shows up, yeah, you can have 1/3 of what we have on hand. Of course, most of what we have is hidden somewhere else. But so he'll get some money, and then this is to fund secular. This is to fund secular warfare against France. It's not like he's raising money for a crusade, right, to fight the Turks or something. This is for secular warfare. Now, England, just geographically, it's too far distant from Rome for the Pope to exercise any efficient sort of control over what's going on there. He protests, of course, but nothing happens. Now, when Philip the Fair of France sees that Edward got away with it, he does the same thing. He starts pressuring the churches to make donations, to give so much of their money to fund the war against England, and as you might expect, the French church protests. Now, whereas Boniface felt that he couldn't do anything about England, France was a different story. France is much closer to Italy. There was more accountability. There was more avenues that Boniface had into France, and so Boniface takes a more active role trying to put down the French oppression of the church than he did in England, and maybe also because he wants to show that the buck needs to stop here. I might have let them get away with it, but if I don't stop it here, this is going to become frequent throughout the Church Universal. And so in 1294, he issues his famous bull Clericos Laicos, which will forbid the church from. It actually strikes both sides. It forbids the sovereigns, on pain of excommunication, from taking wealth from the church without the church's approval, and it also forbids the church from acquiescing in a sovereign's demand, and forbids them from giving the sovereign any money not approved by the Pope. So it essentially forces them to choose whether they're going to be faithful to Peter or to the church. Now, what Boniface doesn't realize is King Philip of France has a very strong trump card on his on the Pope's say in this matter, and that is that Italy and the Papal Court in particular, Rome, gets a lot from exports from France. There's caravans coming all the time from the great fairs of Champagne and all the great markets of France coming down through the Po, going all the way into Rome. And Philip says, fine, I forbid all exports from France to Italy. Now what? Right? And he cuts off that trade. Remember, this is the famous trade route that 100 years earlier that Francis of Assisi's father, Pietro di Bernardone, yearly would go to France to trade, right? The French and the Italian merchants were very much connected. And so the king just shuts down the trade. He says, you're going to shut off the revenue you have power over, and I'm going to shut off mine. So let's see how you do without food, without cloth, And things get very expensive because without trade from France, all you have is the imports that are coming in from the Mediterranean, from the trade with the Genoese and whatnot. So it gets very expensive. In some places, the economy goes very bad. In some places, they even had a hard time with food and whatnot. And all of a sudden, the Pope has his own people, looking angrily at him, kind of like the Israelites to Moses. Where's the leeks and onions we used to eat? What are you
doing? It was better before you started meddling in this affair. And the Pope would eventually relent, and he would allow Philip to make a limited requisition of church funds in exchange for opening up the trade routes again. And this happened, but Philip continued to oppress the church in France to simply confiscate. And so Philip was really moving along without any repercussions. Now, we mentioned the Colonna sometime earlier. The Colonna are exiled in France, and they are the ones that are egging Philip on against Boniface, encouraging him to strike at Boniface to weaken him any way he can. The French king will imprison an important bishop, a bishop from Languedoc, who is supportive of Boniface in France. They exchange a lot of not nice letters. If you've ever read the correspondence of the investiture controversy, you know what I'm talking about, right? The Pope calling him a son of Satan and a heathen and this and that, and the king calling him a false pope and all these things. So they issue a lot of not nice letters. The king declares his practical independence from the jurisdiction of the Pope in matters of the church in France, not unlike, this is really similar to the claims Henry VIII will make in the 1500s, that he is the head of the Church of England, right? So this will go back and forth, and this will culminate in the papal bull Unam Sanctum of 1302, which I think we're going to have a question on in a moment. But after Unam Sanctum, the gloves come off totally, and Philip begins attacking the person of the Pope. He doesn't respond to the arguments of Unam Sanctum. He will plan to attack the Pope's person, and the Pope, while he's visiting another city in Italy, he will be kidnapped by a group of Colonna who are on hand. They storm the city. They will kidnap the Pope and take him away. Shortly after that, the Pope is rescued and taken away from the French and the Colonna. Philip had a plan to kidnap him and bring him to France and hold him prisoner in France. But the Pope got away, although he died very shortly after his imprisonment in 1303. And there's some debate on the cause of his death. Some say that he was maltreated at the hands of the Colonna, that they physically beat him up, and that he died as a result of injuries that he suffered. He was an old man by this time. Others say that his health was already failing, and that while the rigors of his imprisonment probably didn't help, he probably died naturally. We don't really know. But shortly after this, he died after being kidnapped and presumably probably at least roughed up a little bit by the Colonna after Unam Sanctum. And so that's the final culmination of this affair, is the kidnapping and death of Boniface VIII and Philip the Fair, going on without any sort of repercussions whatsoever. I mean, at least temporally.
Indeed. Let's look to Unam Sanctum, as we mentioned. So what are the essential points of teaching Unam Sanctum, and how much of it is, in terms of the Church's theological patrimony of formal teaching and faith and morals, and how much of it is actually more conditioned by the politics of the time?
Yeah, it is very, very well. Okay, so Boniface reaffirms the two-sword theory. He reaffirms the teaching of Innocent III that the church is like that the church and the state are like the sun and the moon, and any power the state has, it gets by means of subsidiarity through the church. So he restates that, but the thing is that Unam Sanctam is most known for its definition. We declare, define, proclaim that it is necessary for salvation for every human person to be subject to the Roman pontiff. That's the closing sentence of the bull. Most people know nothing about, most Catholics, even traditionalist Catholics, I'm afraid, know nothing about this bull other than that sentence. And the interesting thing is that, read in context, this is not making, even though it says every human person, read in context, the bull is not intending to make a statement about every individual person qua individuals. It's meaning to make a statement about individuals qua their belonging to a certain class of people. It's making a statement about classes of people. And this is easy to understand when you understand the background of this argument between Philip and Boniface, because Philip is saying, I am the king of France. A king holds his kingship by the grace of God directly. I manage the affairs of the church in France
the way I see fit, and you have no authority to interfere in what I do in the French church. The same argument Henry VIII will make. And Boniface responds by saying, no, I don't care who you are, whether you're a peasant, whether you're a duke, whether you're a king, there's no group of people who are exempt from the authority of the Pope. Now, he says every human person. He's saying that no matter what class you belong to, whether you're a king, whether you're whatever, you cannot exempt yourself from papal authority, which is what Philip the Fair was trying to do. In other words, many people take the bull as if its primary object is talking about, like Eastern Orthodox and Protestants, like it's talking about people who are outside the fold of the Catholic Church. And by implication, it certainly does, it does have that implication, right? Because it says everybody needs to be subject to the Pope. But it's actually more fittingly and in context used as a statement in relation to the Church's relationship with the state. That's the context that Boniface VIII wrote it in, was a church-state sort of document, not, hey, you Protestants and schismatics out there, this has to pertain to you. Now, the interesting thing about that, though, is that even though that's, and you know this because you study the manuals, so I know you'll affirm what I'm about to say, even though Boniface wrote it in that political context, the Church's later theological tradition has used it in the other context. They've tended to use it as an explanation of the necessity of every individual person to belong to the Catholic Church and be subject to the Pope for their salvation. And that's been the standard way. You can show it again and again and again that the bull has always been used. So then a great question arises, which I'm not competent to answer. What has more authority, the context in which the Pope originally meant the bull, or the way in which subsequent theologians have utilized the infallible pronouncement of the bull? What makes things more confusing is that the Pope who got elected after Boniface VIII, and I can't remember whether it was Benedict XI or Clement V who did this, but they claim to have annulled Unam Sanctum. That is, they nullified it or overturned it or proclaimed it not binding. Now, what does that mean? I don't know, because he clearly said the formula, we declare, define, proclaim, and then he made a pronouncement, and then a subsequent pope overturns it. It's pronounced in one context, it's interpreted in another. So I personally I don't understand the resolution of this. It's been treated as a very, very, very authoritative statement on the necessity of everyone to belong to the Church. But it's not cut and dry either, because there's these canonical questions about it. So if you have any insight on it, I'd love to hear, but it's clear that there's some questions surrounding it.
So the basic way that the manuals read this particular question is, the question of the submission to the Roman Pontiff, it's one of those, it's almost tautological. It's obvious if you're in the Church, you're under the Pontiff, and if you're not under the Pontiff, you're a schismatic. So, right. So basically they treat it in line with four particular, there's basically whatever of the political natures, all the manualists treat it in terms of four basic principles that have to be dealt with. So the first is that the Church is necessary not only for the attainment of salvation, but for the forgiveness of sins, which is inseparable from the granting of the supernatural life of sanctifying grace. The second one is that the Church is necessary for the attainment of salvation and of the life of grace precisely because it is the body and the spouse of Christ. The attainment of salvation in the Church involves union with the Bishop of Rome, and the fourth principle that they draw from this is that the dogma of the Church's necessity for the attainment of eternal salvation cannot be explained accurately in terms of any invisible Church. Right? So that's what theologians have garnered from this. And so one of the things that Vatican I says is that anything that once the Church has declared something, it is in itself unalterable, etc. So you can't reinterpret it in terms of a higher meaning. You find it there or you don't. And so maybe you're widening a certain understanding of the thing in terms of those propositions logically connected to it, but it's not evolving into something entirely different as, well, we won't talk about the synod, but nevertheless, that's more or less where it's going. Or, they see it as the society designated in the St. Robert Bellarmine's definition of the true church as the assembly of men united in the profession of the same Christian faith, and by the communion of the same sacraments, they are under the rule of the legitimate pastors, and especially of the Roman pontiff, who's the one vicar on earth, right? He says in De Ecclesia Militante, which is one of the next books coming out after on the Roman pontiff in my translation series. But so basically, to bring it to a nutshell, is that there is obviously this political end of Unam Sanctum, but there are also theological truths garnered from it.
Sure.
That, that are necessary for faith. And so you could annul, a future pope could annul something in the bull that is purely on the grounds of a political reality or something. Mm-hmm. But he couldn't annul the doctrinal moral teaching in the bull.
Oh, sure.
In the faith and morals. And so basically that's where it would go. How much I'd have to look at those particular things, from the specific popes, but even into the manuals in the early 20th century in the 1930s, they still treat this bull as authoritative. So whatever that.
Yeah, well, I don't think I wasn't mean to suggest that it's questionable whether it's authoritative or not.
Right.
I think that I think the point is you'll see on a lot of like traditionalist websites there's a tendency to just kind of cite papal bulls like, hey, here's a big long list of citations proving X, Y, or Z, and sometimes the reality between the with the scope of what the bull is meaning to declare on, with how theologians have interpreted it, it's a little bit more cut and dry than just, hey, I copied and pasted it out of Denzinger and I'm just going to put it up and it's a open and closed case. So Unam Sanctum is a fascinating bull, and it's clearly very pertinent today. And I think it's very interesting how it's issued, like you mentioned, it's issued in a political context, but there's theological moral points that have continued to be drawn out of it and mulled over in the church's tradition since it's been issued. I don't think Boniface VIII, well, I don't know what he thought, but he was really addressing a situation at hand, a crisis with a particular person, and I don't know if he would have thought that this bull would have gone on to be of such universal importance. In many cases, the one and only thing that he's remembered for.
Indeed. As an addendum to that, this is what the New Catholic Encyclopedia, the Old Catholic Encyclopedia has. That's on New Advent from 1911. It says that when King Philip protested, Pope Clement V was able, in his brief Meroit of 1st February 1306, to declare that the French king and France were to suffer no disadvantage on account of the bull Unam Sanctum, in that the issuing of this bull had not made them subject to the authority of the Roman Church in any other manner than formally.
Right.
In this way, Clement V was able to give France and its ruler a guarantee of security from the ecclesiastical political results of the opinions elaborated in the bull, while its dogmatic decision suffered no detriment of any kind. So, short translation, that even the next pope basically said that its moral and theological teaching is based in the tradition. It applies always and everywhere. But you, France, aren't expected to now be, reduced to a complete vassal and lose all your local rights because of it.
Right.
So that seems to be where it's going.
Right, and to the degree that any future pontiff tries to annul it, it's annulling only only any of the opinions or political whatever implications in the bull, but of course leaving the traditional doctrine untouched.
Certainly. So now we remember Unam Sanctum, and as you said, it's one of the few things that Boniface is remembered for, but as well as total war with the French. But on the other hand, Boniface made at least some contributions to the church. One is that he inaugurated the first Jubilee. What led him to do that, and what was the effect of that?
Yeah, Boniface, we mentioned that he was worldly, but I also said not any more worldly than any other prelate. He had he cared about the spiritual good of the church as well, and this is displayed in the Jubilee of 1300. Now, if we want to just be, pessimistic about it, maybe giving a more negative interpretation, we could say this was just an excuse to show off the temporal splendor of the papacy, and many history books will take that approach. But really, he seems to have been motivated by wanting to open up the spiritual treasury of the church to the faithful. He seemed to, at least in the documents promulgating the Jubilee, he has purely spiritual motives. He wants to open up the means of grace to the faithful. Now, we also have to note that at this time in 1300, the Holy Land had pretty much fallen. There was various outposts on islands here and there, but the Holy Land, the last Christian outpost in the Holy Land had fallen, I think, in when was it? 1281? 1286, okay. So the pilgrimage route to the Holy Land wasn't totally closed, but there was no longer that flood of pilgrims going back and forth to the Holy Land as there had been since the 11th century. And so this was one way to kind of channel the pilgrimage culture within the church for the faithful to still be able to reap the benefits of the spiritual treasures made available through pilgrimage. And I should mention that this had been the case prior to the Crusades. Prior to the Crusades, Rome had been a pilgrimage point and remained so through the Middle Ages. But now that Jerusalem had fallen some time ago and that all the outposts had fallen, Boniface was trying to restore this earlier tradition of pilgrimage to Rome, and for the purpose of opening up the church's spiritual treasury. So that was one of the motivations. It also, now he didn't invent indulgences, obviously, but I think that this first Jubilee really popularized indulgences in the late Middle Ages. So because there was very generous indulgences for those who would visit the station church. And it's really funny if you read his declaration of indulgence, because there was a lot of Christians who lived in Rome who were like, oh yes, I live in Rome, it's easy for me to go visit the station churches and get the indulgence. And it's funny because the declaration says, if you live in Rome, you have to visit them for 30 days straight. You have to go to each one 30 times to fulfill the pilgrimage. So if you're from far away, you just got to come. If you live right there in Rome, you got to visit them 30 times. So it was kind of funny that he put, it's like, nope, not that easy. Like you live next door to St. Paul outside the walls. It's not going to be that simple. But so, maybe there was a bit of increase in the temporal splendor of the papacy, but whatever, it was very successful. He had 200,000 pilgrims that year, which is huge for the Middle Ages. They had to knock down a portion of the Leonine Wall to accommodate. They actually had to, widen the gates of the city to let all the people in. It was a tremendous success. Now it's notable that not a single monarch, with the exception, I think, of some second-born prince in I think in the Kingdom of Naples or something, but other than that, no monarch came to Rome on the Jubilee year to pay homage to the Pope and visit the station churches, which was an ominous sign. But it was clearly a great benefit to the church, and it really, I don't know if you could connect this directly, but that moving into the 1300s and culminating in the 1400s, there's a great intensification of lay piety, of kind of lay spirituality, a great proliferation of spiritual works, the most famous being the Imitation of Christ, but also the great German spiritual movement, all these different sort of spiritual movements. This Jubilee year can kind of be seen, I think, at least chronologically, as the beginning of this period of late medieval lay piety. I'd be interested to try to see if we could put together a more direct correlation, but it definitely kicks off this period. So it was a great benefit to the church, and of course, the church has continued to have jubilees. Now, Boniface had originally envisioned that jubilees would happen only once every 100 years. He was not observed in this. I think they had 2 or 3 more in the 14th century alone. And now, of course, we talked earlier about the church's weapons getting blunted from being used too much. I wonder if the same thing is happening, where we had a jubilee in 2000, and now we have a jubilee year of mercy. Was there one in between? That was the last one, right? Was 2000?
I'm not actually sure, because as you said, it's kind of gotten blunted. Well, the other thing that they have inaugurated is dedicating the year to this person, and it's kind of ominous when they do, because it tends to be the exact opposite is taking place. And so they had the year of the priest in 2011, and then really it's the year of the shafting of the priest, as the average parish priest loses more rights and privileges, and now they have more and more are getting accused because of the bad clergy that the bishops kind of promote and move around and all these other things. And then
the year of religious vocations or whatever was the year when they rolled over on the LCWR thing, and now we have the year of the year of faith was a year of unprecedented atheist attacks against the church, and now we have the year of mercy. So when the year of mercy is announced, that should tell you that we're about to see a perversion of mercy.
Well, that's precisely what's happening, And so, as a future episode I'm going to have on the Synod will make clear. But in the meantime, so there's another element, too, in which art historians will say that Boniface had tried to just merely increase the temporal splendor of the papacy. Yet he is often credited for furthering the Renaissance. And so what do we make of this particular accomplishment? What did he actually accomplish in patronizing the arts as he did?
Well, he was a vociferous collector of Greek works, of Greek written works. He had many sent over from Constantinople. He commissioned art throughout Rome on a previously unknown scale. No pontiff before had beautified Rome to such a degree. He brought Giotto to Rome for the Jubilee, and Giotto's frescoes throughout Rome on the occasion of the Jubilee are some of his most well-known works. And Giotto, of course, is seen as one of the founding fathers of the Renaissance. Boniface restored all the major basilicas of Rome, including St. Peter's, in what could be called, I guess, a proto-Renaissance style. The Renaissance style hadn't formed yet, but he was clearly not in the Gothic anymore. This was a kind of proto-Renaissance style. He founded 2 universities, which was a very, the Renaissance is associated with the flourishing of studies, of original sources and whatnot. So he founded 2 universities. He did quite a bit for the city of Rome, quite a bit for the artistic heritage of Rome. In his thirsting for Greek works, he was foreshadowing the Renaissance in his architecture, in his academic pursuits with the universities, in Giotto's work. So, yeah, I think it's right to say that he kicks off the artistic, kind of the artistic movement in Rome. Whether I would say that he founded the Renaissance, that might be a bit much, but he definitely is there at the beginning, and I think we have to, we definitely have to credit him with that.
Certainly, and the importance of Giotto in so many ways in starting the Renaissance, and just because Giotto is one of those, I guess maybe it's a good point for the epilogue here. He is looking forward as well as looking back, and a lot of his frescoes still show the ideas present in Greek iconography, and still it's still the concept of writing, in doctrine in art, in painting. Yet at the same time, he still moves it forward to a different level that's more dependent on the three-dimensional form, more dependent on an accurate depiction physically as well as what's doctrinally meant. And you see this with his frescoes, St. Francis in Florence. At the very least, the frescoes that are certainly his in Assisi, as well as those attributed to him that probably he might have been involved in, but it certainly weren't only his work. You have, many other places. You have this looking backward and also looking forward. And are you going to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say it's really interesting to look at Giotto's his famous the painting of St. Francis confronting his father in the Square of Assisi, and also I think the deposition of Christ. You can see that the looking backward, he's got kind of the two-dimensional approach that was so prevalent throughout the Middle Ages, but he's moving into a certain sort of perspective. And you can see on the buildings in these paintings that he's trying to do perspective, but he hasn't quite figured out the formula yet. Some of the buildings are, they're wider at the wrong end, or the perspective goes the wrong way, but you can see that he's definitely foreshadowing the Renaissance in getting the perspective into the work that was lacking in the High Middle Ages, but he's still definitely in the development of that high medieval kind of two-dimensional tradition. So he's just a perfectly transitional artist in really a transitional time and a transitional pope.
Indeed. So coming to that, what's the net effect of Boniface for the future relations of church and state? We've talked about it a little bit, but...
Well, the big thing is, it's fascinating to look at what could have been in history. I don't know what any other pope other than Boniface would have done. I do know that Boniface followed things up in quite a major way, whether that's due to Boniface's own personality or whether just because of the rise of the nation state and what was happening, that this was bound to happen with any pope? I don't know. Boniface had some good things about him. The Jubilee was a good thing. The things he did in Rome were good, but he he really is the beginning of the rending of Christendom. He is the beginning of the period that will culminate in the Reformation. And for those of us who truly are familiar with medieval history, the Reformation is not a beginning. The Reformation is an end. The Reformation is the end of what started in 1300. It's the end of the sundering of the political from the spiritual, of faith and reason, and the great medieval harmony. In fact, you did a review for my source book, The Rending of Christendom, which is a book of primary sources, a home study guide for high school students. And of course, we begin the Rending of Christendom book with excerpts from Pope Gelasius on the two-sword theory, and then going right to Boniface VIII with Clericos Laicos and Unam Sanctam, because I think the events of 1517 are incomprehensible without looking at the events of 1300 to 1302. So he begins the Rending of Christendom, and immediately his pontificate immediately precedes the so-called Babylonian captivity of the Church. His successor, Benedict XI, will reign for only 1 year, and then in 1304, this is the high point of King Philip the Fair, who no longer has Boniface as the thorn in his side. He will push through the election of the Frenchman Clement V. The papacy will move to Avignon, where it will be, until the late 1300s. And so Boniface's defeat by Philip really has real consequences for the papacy. The papacy during this period will be the tool of the French monarchs, and if you want to see the dramatic, power that Philip has now that Boniface is gone, we could look at the unjust dissolution of the Templars only 10 years after, I think about 10 years after the inauguration of the Avignon papacy, that Philip can pressure the Pope to issue the condemnation of the Templars throughout all of Christendom. And of course, it's interesting how we talk about cafeteria Catholicism as if it's a modern phenomenon, right? The Pope excommunicates the king and nothing happens. But then when the Pope says, you can confiscate the treasures of the Templars, watch how quick the kings move to obey the Pope to show how pious they are, right? to get them wealth.
That's right.
So yeah, and of course the Babylonian captivity, we know that leads directly to the Great Western Schism. We know the Great Western Schism leads directly to the Reformation. So this really is chronologically and kind of in a more intimate sense, logically, the beginning of the dissolution of Christendom.
Fascinating, as always.
Yep.
Well, Philip Campbell, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Ryan. Look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Same here.